My name is Adam Lazowski. I'm a professor of European law at the Westminster Law School in London. I also assist GIZ project in Albania. During this session, we're going to look at the legislative gap analysis, how to conduct it, how to update it, and how important it is for the approximation exercise in Albania. The first starting point for us today is really the answer to the very simple question where to start. So where do we start the approximation exercise and how we can use legislative gap assessment? There is a number of things that we will look at later in this session. For instance, how to make an inventory of EU acquis, how to make an inventory of national law, how to prepare tables of concordance to make sure that Albanian law is compatible with EU legislation, and also how to assess the legislative gaps to see where still approximation effort is required. Then we will look at the planning, which is very, very crucial for approximation exercise. And finally, I'm going to talk about coordination of planning and monitoring of implementation of national plan for approximation, which in case of Albania is the National Plan for European Integration, approved in June 2014. Planning, when it comes to approximation, is everything. And planning, that's the bottom line, should not be done in a hurry. It should be done in a very organized and structured way. Simply, we are dealing with thousands of legal acts that need to be approximated with, and this simply takes time. Now, every country has its own way of dealing with approximation with planning, be it a candidate country like Albania, a country negotiating membership like Montenegro and Serbia at the moment, or member states of the European Union which have to implement EU legislation within the deadlines laid down in EU acquis, because if they don't, financial penalties might follow. The comprehensive legislative gap analyses were developed a few years ago in order to assist Albanian public administration in approximation effort. They are working tools, living working tools for approximation. They allow identification of gaps between the national law in Albania and EU acquis, and they are supposed to assist the Albanian authorities in the planning of approximation. Now, the bottom line is they have to be updated on a regular basis, because only then they can serve as useful tools for the updates of the National Plan for European Integration, sectoral strategies, and so on. They might be also useful for reporting purposes. They are comprehensive, therefore they give a full picture of EU law. They cover all possible sources of EU law, be them binding, secondary legislation, directives, regulations, and also case law of the Court of Justice. And ideally, the LGAs should be prepared before planning starts, because first we see where the gaps are, and then we can plan how to fill those gaps. They are relatively big documents. They cover entire acquis in a given area of EU law and respective legislation in the national legal order, in our case, in the Albanian legal order. When it comes to EU law, they cover primary law, the treaties, if their provisions are relevant in a given area, and also secondary legislation, which includes EU regulations, EU directives, in justice and home affairs also framework decisions. They cover also soft law, non-binding legal acts, which, however, may be of approximation relevance. Most recent Commission recommendation on online gambling may be a very good example. They also cover case law of the Court of Justice. Case law is an important source of EU acquis, and one cannot really conduct a comprehensive and full approximation exercise without using case law of the Court of Justice. The importance of jurisprudence varies from one area or another to another, but still the judgments of the court have a fundamental role in this legal order. Important part of the LGAs, the heart of the LGAs, are tables of concordance. Tables of concordance prepared for every single piece of EU legislation, not for every single piece of Albanian legislation. It's very important to remember that. Tables of concordance only become useful in approximation exercise where we know exactly where a particular provision of EU acquis is implemented in Albania. So once again, for every single piece of EU legislation we have a table of concordance. EU law is simply a point of reference in this exercise. The tables of concordance that have been used for the legislative gap assessments, they follow the model which was developed by the European Commission and is used by other candidate countries and also by the member states themselves. The first step in our exercise is preparation of inventory of EU legislation. You will find such inventory in Annex 1 of the Legislative Gap Assessment. It allows us to verify which legal acts the European Union has in a given area, what kind of proposals are in the pipeline in the EU decision making, and to what extent we can use case law of the Court of Justice. While preparing such an inventory of EU acquis, we also should proceed with inventory of Albanian law, and that's what the authors of LGAs have done. So you will have on the CD-ROMs all relevant Albanian legislation, and wherever it was possible, in English and in Albanian. A number of LGAs has been prepared in the last years. They follow the same structure. They are available on CD-ROMs. When you insert a CD-ROM into your computer, that's what you're going to see. The LGA is divided into a number of parts. In the first folder, folder A, you will have EU legal acts. Folder B, Albanian legislation. Folder C, with tables of concordance. The gap assessment in a separate Word file. And finally, guidelines, how to develop and update legislative gap assessment. If we open the first folder, you will see that EU acquis is divided into primary legislation, mainly the treaties, secondary legislation, soft law, and case law of the Court of Justice. To guide you through this, you have Annex 1 with a summary of EU legal acts covering given area. I will return to this a little bit later. So for instance, if we open the folder secondary legislation, you will see in this very case all relevant acquis in chapter 3, right of establishment and free movement of services. Those are consolidated versions of those legal acts in PDF format, downloaded from the Eurolex website, which is an outlet where EU law is officially published. Later in this course, I will guide you through the Eurolex website to demonstrate how to search legal acts there. If we look at soft law folder, in this particular area there is no soft law available at this stage, but the folder of course is created on a CD-ROM simply to allow you to update the legislative gap assessment as you progress with work and as EU law develops. Next folder covers the case law of the Court of Justice. And as you can see now on the screen, we have subfolders here with case law on relevant pieces of EU acquis. So for instance, if we open this folder, you will see all relevant judgments and opinions of advocates general, if available, on the directive on posting of workers. And again, those judgments are taken from the Eurolex website. Those are the final versions of the judgments as published in the European Court reports that is until the end of 2013, and as of 2014 as published in PDF at the website of the Court of Justice, which is now the official publication of those judgments. That was folder A. In folder B, we have Albanian legislation divided as the chapter is divided into 3 parts: right of establishment, free movement of services, postal services, and mutual recognition of professional qualifications. If we open this one, we have all relevant Albanian laws plus decrees of Prime Minister and other sub-legal acts. Folder C includes tables of concordance. They are in Word format, not in PDF, and that's for a very good reason, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, LGAs are living instruments. Those tables need to be updated regularly as EU law and as Albanian law develops. For instance, if we look at the table of concordance for Directive 2005/36, that's the Directive on Recognition of Professional Qualifications, you see that Albanian law is in some parts partly compatible with EU acquis, in some parts not compatible. Later in this course we will look at those tables of concordance in details, and I shall explain how to prepare them, what's the logic behind them, and how to update them as well. So in this folder, folder C, we have all tables of concordance which are relevant for this chapter. And finally we have the guidelines on developing gap assessments and their update, with key tips for those who work on law approximation. As you see, explanation what are LGAs, how to update them, where to find relevant information, and how to make recommendations, plus list of the useful websites. In the folder with EU legal acts, folder A, as I mentioned before, we have the annex with summary of EU legal acts applicable in the given area. This is how Annex 1 looks like. First, we have the relevant provisions of primary law, which in this very case, which is Chapter 3, are provisions of the Treaty on Functioning of the European Union. There are only 3 columns here. First, the number of the provision in the treaty, the text of the provision, and information whether that particular provision of the treaty is of relevance for the approximation exercise. And in our case, definitely so. If you scroll down, you see secondary legislation. That's the list of legal acts in this area with their SELEX number and short information if those legal acts contain self-executing provisions. Self-executing provisions we mainly find in regulations, which are in EU law directly applicable, which means they apply directly in all member states and should not be copied to national law. And this way we have unified rules in all 28 member states of the European Union. As you see now on the screen, we have the list of existing legislation, but also list of pending proposals. It's important to have them also in the annex to be aware what is happening in EU law, what kind of legal acts we can expect in the future. As I mentioned, there's no soft law that was relevant for this area at the time when the LGA was prepared. Finally, we have case law of the Court of Justice, case law per piece of EU legislation. In this very case, it starts with case law based on the provisions of the treaty, which are of relevance. It is important to include the most recent case law on the top of the list, because this way it's easier to update. You just simply add one judgment after another as they are rendered by the Court of Justice. As you see from this brief overview, there is a plethora of case law in this area of EU law, judgments sometimes going back to 1960s even. Next, after the treaty, we have Directive on Free Movement of Services in the Internal Market, then recognition of professional qualifications and other legal acts falling under this chapter. And finally, we have summaries of selected judgments, which are there simply to allow those who use LGAs to go quickly through case law of the court and identify which judgments, which parts of judgments are relevant for the approximation exercise. First, briefly, the factual background of the case is discussed, and then it is followed by the questions, for instance, that were submitted by national courts, and finally by answers of the Court of Justice. So those are summaries allowing you, once again, to quickly scan through judgments of the court. All lawyers that deal with EU law are fully aware that case law can be tricky to digest, to read and apply. So those summaries are simply here to help those who use LGAs, which of course doesn't stop them then from reading the judgments in full, as they are also available on the CD-ROM, as I demonstrated a few minutes ago. Approximation exercise is a bit like a good comedy, and the essence of good comedy, like approximation, is timing. Timing is everything here, and it starts with planning, then with the approximation of effort itself, and finally with implementation. While drafting new provisions, the line ministries have to involve the Ministry of European Integration, which has a lot of expertise in EU law. Approximation in that sense is a combined effort of a number of authorities. While planning the approximation, it is important also to check if there are any new developments coming in EU law, any new pieces of legislation, for instance, any soft law instruments. Later in this course I will demonstrate how to do it. Now, why is it important to verify if anything is happening in EU law? Simply because if a new proposal for an EU directive or EU regulation is well advanced in the decision-making process, it might be fitting for the Albanian authorities to wait a little and then proceed with approximation with a new EU legal act, not the old one. Simply not to repeat the approximation exercise every 2-3 years in a given area of law. Case law should be also closely followed. That is easy. I will demonstrate later in this course how to do it. But you can monitor on a regular basis what is happening in Luxembourg at the Court of Justice of the European Union. There are notifications when cases are submitted to the court. The agenda of the court is freely available on the website, and so are the judgments and opinions of Advocate General. For instance, in Chapter 3, we have a lot of judgments of the court that should be followed. And also, we have the Commission's Single Market Act, which is a multi-annual action plan for new legislation in this area of law. So when the Commission published the Single Market Act a few years ago, it was very easy to flag those areas of national law that might be affected by this exercise. 3 examples: intellectual property, public procurement, and recognition of professional qualifications. In all these 3 areas of EU law, we had a lot of new legislation in the last 2 years, legislation which had been planned by the Commission in the Single Market Act. As I already mentioned, tables of concordance are at the heart of legislative gap assessments. Tables of concordance should be the starting point for the approximation effort, not a cherry on the top of the cake that we put when the draft law or draft DCM is prepared. Obviously, it is a tedious exercise. It requires a lot of work, but it is the only way to identify thoroughly where the gaps between Albanian law and EU acquis remain. As you will see in a moment, we have a number of columns that have to be filled by the drafters. One of them is a column for additional information. That's where we should discuss what the gaps are. That's where we can include references to the Court of Justice and many other useful information. The table which you have on the screen covers Directive 2009/101, which is one of the company law directives. As you can see, the EU acquis is on the left-hand side. As I mentioned, it is the point of reference for the assessment of legislative gaps. On the right-hand side, you will have relevant Albanian legislation, both the existing legislation and also the draft which you are preparing. There are in total 7 columns that need to be filled. Column number 1 is just easy, simple. You type in the number of the provision in the EU acquis, be it a regulation or directive or any other legal act. In column number 2, you have the text of EU acquis in its entirety, so the entire provision which is relevant here. Columns 3 to 6 refer to Albanian legislation. Since the tables are quite chunky and we're using usually the Microsoft Office software, it's easier to keep them short, simple, and that's the reason why you have the 3rd column for reference. So instead of typing in everywhere law number X of particular date and the title of the laws are given and draft laws are given numbers, and those are the references. So 01 is the law on National Registration Centre. Number 2 is the law on companies, and number 3 is the draft law. And that's how those references will appear later in the text. For instance, here, Article 2, Paragraph A of the directive, reference to Albanian legislation, the first listed above, relevant provision, the number of the provision of the Albanian legislation, that's column number 4, and column number 5, the most important one here, which is the text of Albanian legislation. Now, only when you put the text of EU law against the text of Albanian law, you can make a full assessment of a legislative gap, or legislative gaps, because there can be many of them. Once you make the assessment, you refer to column number 6 and decide whether Albanian law is fully compatible, partly, or not compatible at all. If we go back to the top of the table, you see that those 3 symbols are explained: F, P, and N. F for full approximation, P for partial, and N for non-compliance. Exactly the same methodology is used for the assessment of compatibility in the National Plan for European Integration for 2014-2020. Column number 7 is, as I mentioned already, column for remarks. So all comments which the drafters feel fitting to put. For instance, Article 1 of this directive has no approximation relevance because it applies only to the member states of the European Union. Once such information is put in this column, it is clear for drafters that they don't have to worry about Article 1 until Albania joins the European Union. And since it has no approximation relevance at this stage, the drafters have put here an A, not applicable. You will also have provisions in EU legislation which are optional, where a directive or regulation says member states may. Quite often then in tables of concordance you also put not applicable and explain in the comment column that this provision is optional for the member states, which simply means it doesn't have to be followed by member states themselves as well as candidate and potential candidate countries. Now this table is not very long, it's 24 pages. Obviously in some areas of law, for instance food law, food safety, the tables of concordance would be very, very long, going for hundreds of pages. That is why I mentioned that to put a table together is a tedious exercise. But as I've just demonstrated, it's a very good way of verifying whether national law is compatible with EU acquis and to what extent. When you prepare a table of concordance, it is really crucial to highlight those provisions of national law which are not in compliance with EU acquis. We need to identify also those provisions of EU acquis which simply have no equivalence whatsoever in national law. That's basically where you start with a blank sheet of paper. Once those gaps are identified, a very important stage of approximation starts. That is the planning. How do we plan to approximate with this particular piece of legislation? How do we plan to fill those gaps that we identified while putting together a table of concordance? Albania, as a candidate country, has an obligation to accept all acquis by the date of accession. The only exception will be those legal acts where transitional periods will be negotiated. As the example of Croatia proves, those can go from very detailed technical legislation, for instance on sizes of cages for hens laying eggs, to land ownership, to free movement of workers. Now, how do we then plan the approximation? Before we put dates into the national plan for European integration, it may be worth to conduct a regulatory impact assessment, simply to see what will be the economic impact of the new legislation, for instance on Albanian companies. We don't want to put a straitjacket on Albanian companies at the time when they need investment and they need to develop to prepare for fierce competition on the internal market. Now, such regulatory impact assessment will tell us when ideally we should proceed with approximation works, whether it is feasible to do it now or during the accession negotiations or maybe towards the end of them, so to approximate literally before the accession to the European Union. So planning has to take into account also the economic effects of legislation. How do we exactly then plan the approximation works? On the one hand, as I just mentioned, with the accession negotiations commencing, we have quite strict deadlines. On the other hand, Albanian authorities have some leverage, can plan the activities for the next 5, 6, 7 years or more. The plan has to be comprehensive. In the National Plan for European Integration, you put the planning for the next 3 years, including the current year. However, you should straight away envisage when mid-term you will plan to approximate. And tables of concordance, the gap assessments, allow you to have a full comprehensive view of where you should start and how you should proceed. Planning has to be coordinated. it is absolutely crucial for approximation exercise, for compliance checking, but also for reporting and the future negotiations. Coordination of planning is of highest importance. You will have legislation that falls in the mandate of 2 or sometimes even 3 line ministries. Therefore, they need to work together also with Ministry of European Integration, while preparing the approximation legislation. But coordination is not only crucial for the planning itself and approximation, it's also crucial for reporting, for accession negotiations, including the screening exercise, which is the starting point, a very important one, because that's when Albania will declare if it will comply with EU acquis in relevant chapter by the date of accession, or will rather seek transitional periods, of which I spoke about a few minutes ago. The plan therefore has to be detailed and also has to be feasible. Therefore, it might be worth to set modest plans for the next short-term perspective and more comprehensive plans for the years closer to accession to the European Union. And also, it might be worth to look at the experience of the young member states that joined in 2004 and new member state Croatia, as well as current candidate and potential candidate countries.